Please welcome Professor Mattias Desmet.
Thank you. Thank you. I have given many book presentations by now, and I always start them in a different way. Today, I will start by telling you a little bit about how I came to write this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. I can begin very early. I come from a religious family. My father didn't identify with any religion, but he had a certain religious sentiment. He was aware of a certain religious feeling, and I think I as well as a child. And at the same time, I also was very much interested in martial arts, and in particular in the more mystical, spiritual component of the martial arts. And besides of that, so on the one hand I had this religious, mystical side in myself, and then on the other hand, I think I was also a very rational person. I really had this tendency to really try to understand things in a rational way in life. And if I tried to understand something, I did it good. I continued to try to understand it until I had the feeling that I really understood what I wanted to understand. And when I was 15 years old, I started to really become interested in the sciences. And I think within 1 year, I became an atheist. I couldn't imagine anymore. I started to read Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. I started to study physics a little bit, and in like 1 year time, I think, I started to see the universe truly as a material phenomenon, as a set of elementary particles, atoms, molecules, which all interact according to the laws of mechanics, and which can be perfectly understood in a rationalist way, like a little bit like Laplace believed, the famous French mathematician and physicist of the 19th century. And I just couldn't imagine how in such a universe there would be a God or something. And I'm happy to say that, for a few years I really considered the world in a truly materialist and rationalist way. And I still remember when that started to change. Like, I believe that I was about 19 years old when I read a small book, which some of you might know, the Celestine Prophecy. It was very popular then, and it's terribly written. I tried to read it again 1 year ago or something, and I just couldn't read it because I felt like headaches when I tried to read it. But still, no matter how poorly written it was the first time that I started to see that there was like a very populist and simple introduction in quantum physics in that book, or to quantum physics in that book. And no matter how poorly written it was sufficient to make me see that the materialist view on man in the world was not correct. And that, for instance, one of these basic elementary principles of materialism, namely that everything of the level of our consciousness, everything that used to be referred to as the soul and the spirit, can be reduced to, let's say, a biochemical process in the brain. I suddenly started to see that this just was not true. The biochemical processes in the brain are at least as much a process of our consciousness as that they determine our consciousness. So that was the beginning of since then, I started to, it was a true relief for me, because I didn't like to see the world as a materialist system, but up until then, just my own, yeah, I just couldn't see what else it would be than a materialist system. And this little book made me suddenly see that there was something else than materialism in life, and than rationalism. And it took me, actually. So I think that I was about 19 years old when I noticed that this materialist view of man in the world, which is so dominant, which is probably the mainstream and dominant view of man in the world in our society, that this materialist view of man in the world was simply, from a scientific point of view, incorrect. And it took me, I think, more than 16 years, when I was about 35 years old, before I could see that also the rationalist view of man in the world, that this entire idea, like one very important aspect of the materialist view of man in the world is the belief that the entire universe is a material system, and that this material system can perfectly be understood and explained in rationalist terms. That our rational understanding can grasp the essence of life, the essence of the universe. That's, I think, the most important characteristic of the materialist view of man in the world. It's also this belief in rationalism, this belief in the power of human rationality, I think, which makes this materialist worldview so attractive. It's this belief that the human mind, human rationality, that the categories of our rational thinking can grasp the essence of life, that makes us believe, that creates the illusion in the human being, that if our rational understanding is perfect enough, we will be able to understand, control, and manipulate our lives to the extent that we will understand the machine of the universe and the human being as a small machine which is in a little part of the big machine, that we will understand this human machine well enough to eliminate all suffering and even death from human existence, and that our rational understanding will be capable of bringing the human being to a kind of rationalist paradise where it will live eternally and forever in a state of, let's say, biochemically induced happiness. And that's something that people like Saint-Simon articulated already, this idea that they articulated already back in, I think, the end of the 18th century, and that's something that people like Yuval Noah Harari articulate now in his book Homo Deus, for instance. So it is, I think it's this rationalist idea, this belief that the human being can become godlike on the basis of his own rational understanding. I think it's this rationalist belief that makes the materialist view of the man in the world so attractive. And it took me, while I could see very soon that the materialism itself is wrong, for instance, that you cannot reduce the phenomenon of consciousness to a biochemical or materialist substrate. I could see that quite early, but it took me more than 16 years, until I was about 35 years, I think, before I suddenly understood that also this rationalist idea was wrong, that the essence of life can never be grasped in a rational way. Until then, for me, it was unthinkable that there would exist something that could not be understood in a rational way. I just could not imagine. If you look at the world around you, it behaves logically. And as it behaves logically, you should be able, maybe it will be difficult, but you should be able to rationally understand it. And it took me until I was 35 years old, until I suddenly could see that it was that this is also not true, that this is an illusion as well. And it was I was at that moment, I was studying the mathematical basis of a complex dynamical systems theory. It was when I was writing my first book which was titled, which is titled, The Pursuit of Objectivity and Psychology, a book that, just like my psychology of totalitarianism was banned at university. I have a certain talent to write books who are very friendly, but who make people extremely angry. I don't know, I don't know exactly why. Thank you. It was when I was writing this first book, The Pursuit of Objectivity and Psychology, I will come back to that book later on, when I suddenly understood, when I was studying the mathematical basis of complex dynamical systems theory, and I suddenly understood that the essence of life and the essence of nature simply cannot be grasped in rational categories, and even more, that this is exactly what real science shows us. Everyone thinks that this rationalist fueled man in the world, this materialist fueled man in the world, is the scientific fueled man in the world. That's not true at all. All major scientists and the most sublime and sophisticated scientific theories show us exactly the opposite. They show us that the essence of life transcends rationality. And no theory shows this better and more tangible than complex dynamical systems theory. Complex dynamical systems theory shows us, so complex dynamical systems theory emerged in somewhere back in, I think, like the 1950s, the 1960s. And it shows us that each complex dynamical system in nature, and for instance, like one of the most concrete examples of a complex dynamical system is convection patterns in boiling water, for instance. Well, it shows us, complex dynamical systems theory, that each complex dynamical system in nature, which are almost all phenomena in nature, literally behaves like an irrational number in mathematics. It is determined in a mathematical way. You can find the formula for every complex dynamical system. It's very difficult. The formula are very difficult, even for relatively simple complex dynamical systems, such as convection patterns in water. The mathematical formulas are extremely difficult to understand. They are like iterative differential equations, difficult to understand, but you can find them. But even with these formula in your hand, you cannot predict the behavior of the system for 1 second. So there are certain phenomena who are mathematically determined, but strictly unpredictable. And Edward Lorenz called that deterministic unpredictability. I won't go into the maths, but just what for me was extremely important at that moment, I understood that literally the essence of life, literally transcends rationality, that you can never understand it with your brains. And I suddenly understood why someone like Niels Bohr, the famous Copenhagen physicist, about 30 years earlier said, when it comes to atoms, he said, language can only be used as poetry. And poetry, mystical language, also in Niels Bohr thought in a very fundamental way about mysticism. Poetry, in the end, has a larger capacity to grasp reality than rationality. And I suddenly, when I studied complex dynamical systems theory, I suddenly really understood what Niels Bohr wanted to say. He wanted to say, your rational thinking is absolutely not capable of grasping something of the essence of life. That was for me like a real aha-erlebnis, a moment when I suddenly understood something of the essence of life. And that was how I, for me, in a certain way, I continue to be interested in the sciences up until today, but I realize much better that the essence is to be found somewhere else. But I'm very grateful for science. I think that shows that, for me, science is one of the great fruits of the tree of humanity, absolutely. And I'm very grateful for all the people the scientists who contributed to science, just because it shows exactly this so clearly. Don't think that your rational understanding is the most essential activity of yourself as a human being. I had a completely different set of experiences with what some call the sciences. When I started working at university, on the one hand you have the great sciences, the sciences which really show us something interesting, such as complex dynamical systems theory. But many people confuse this true science with what happens at university. When I was 18 years old, I went to university against the will of my father. My father didn't want to go me to university. He said, they will do everything to kill your passion to know there. and I decided to go anyway. Well, I decided to study psychology, and I'm glad I did so. And after I graduated as a psychologist, I had the opportunity to do a PhD. And there, during my PhD, I really started to understand in what a terrible state the academic world is, and in what a terrible state academic research is. So I started my PhD in psychology. I started to do my PhD research, and I was supposed to investigate, to do a classical psychological research in which I would investigate associations between certain personality traits and depressive symptoms. And as they usually do in psychology, I was supposed to first measure personality traits and depressive symptoms with so-called psychological tests, and then compute or calculate statistical associations between the personality traits and the depressive symptoms. And the first thing I noticed that when I used 3 different psychological tests to measure the same, that the 3 tests led to a completely different measurement result. And I just decided, like, look, I will not continue doing such research for 4 years. And I asked my promoter if I could do a different kind of research, if I could investigate the quality of psychological research. And I was allowed to do so. And I got an additional master degree in these years because I wanted to really be able to pinpoint why most psychological research can never lead to valid results. And I wanted to describe that as well as possible in a mathematical way. So I decided to get an additional master degree, a master degree in quantitative analysis and statistics. And by the end of my PhD, I presented a manuscript which, in my opinion, is still, until today, the most concrete proof that most psychological research, to be honest, has no scientific value at all. I could show the examples. Yeah, but it's true. It's terrible to say, but it is true, and I show this in a very tangible and concrete way, and literally there were like 5% of my colleagues in academic psychology who really had the feeling that I had revealed something fundamental, but 95% of them was really angry at me. And that was the first time that I was baffled and mind-boggled by the fact that very intelligent people, because most of my colleagues were intelligent people, that they can continue to believe in something that is utterly absurd. And when you show it to them that it is utterly absurd, they won't open their eyes, they will just get angry with you. While I was doing my PhD, so I started my PhD in 2003, and while I was doing it, like 2 years later, in 2005, the so-called replication crisis started. I don't know if you're familiar with that, with the replication crisis. It was a crisis that showed that actually this problem that I had been describing in psychology was not only a problem of psychology, but that it also existed in most other academic domains. And that for me was a real surprise. Up until then I thought, like, look, this problem here that I described in psychological research, it's typical for the social sciences, I thought, which was not true at all. It was even worse in the medical sciences. In the medical sciences, up to 85% of the published papers cannot be reproduced. That means that if a certain research group does a certain experiment, and that research group gives his observations, his quantitative observations, his measurements to a second research group, and the second research group repeats the analysis, that in more than 85% of the cases, the second research group will come to fundamentally different conclusions than the first one. You almost cannot imagine it. So up to 85% of the papers in the medical field can even not be reproduced, which means as much as that they actually have no objective scientific value at all. John Ioannidis, one of the people who spoke out during the corona crisis as well from the beginning, published a wonderful paper about that, I think in 2005, and the title of the paper is "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." I've been talking with him, and he said, I almost don't dare to say it, but I almost never found a paper without major mistakes. Oh. Yeah. So the replication crisis started, and at that moment, I really had a feeling that our culture and society was in a very, very, very deep crisis without even knowing it. Our culture, our society, attributes all authority to the academic world, to what they believe science is, but actually they believe in knowledge that is in most respects utterly absurd. I started to realize that we are in a deep crisis, an epistemological crisis. And later on, after my PhD, I decided to try to do, I got the opportunity to do a postdoc because, well, by the time I finished my PhD, 95% of the academic world was really angry with me, and in a strange way, it's almost a miracle, but I got a professorship because I was a candidate for a professorship, and I had, I think, 3 or 4 times more academic publications because I had only written critical publications, but I published a lot, and I had 3 or 4 times more academic publications than a second candidate, and that helped a little bit. No matter how angry they were with me, they were fair enough to say, look, you are the one who deserves the professorship, and I got it actually. And I decided to focus. I decided to leave my critical research line, and I decided to focus to try to do really good research about a topic that had been fascinating me, I think, since I was a child. And I started to do research in which I investigated what the impact of speech, the impact of speech, yes, the articulation of words, is on the mental and physical functioning of a human being. And so I audio and videotape, no, audio taped. I did a few videotapes as well, but more than 95% was audio tapes. I audio taped conversations between patients and their psychotherapists, sometimes for 4 or 5 years straight. And at the same time, I gathered blood, saliva, and hair samples of these people, and I studied how the biochemistry of the blood changes while someone changes the narratives he uses to refer to himself. And this line of research was extremely complex. I continued doing that research for, I think, like about 8 or 9 years. And then slowly, I started to understand that a major part of the psychological functioning of a human being can actually never be understood on the basis of individual psychology. You need group psychology. You need to understand a human being is a being that exists in the relationships with others. And I started to understand that, like, a lot of the fundamental psychological processes can only be understood if you study an individual as a part of a group. And that was the moment where I started to be interested in mass psychology and in the phenomenon of mass formation. I became fascinated by the fact that like mass phenomena, and in particular mass formation, have such a profound impact on the human being, completely changes in many respects the psychological and mental functioning of a human being. Started to study it, and then I soon started to understand that it is exactly this process of mass formation which is responsible for what we call totalitarianism. So, and I started to understand that there was that it was this phenomenon of mass formation that could explain why the first totalitarian states emerged in the beginning of the 20th century. Before the 20th century, there were no totalitarian states. Before the 20th century, there were classical dictatorships, but there were no totalitarian states. A totalitarian state is something completely different than a classical dictatorship. A classical dictatorship is very simple at the psychological level. In a classical dictatorship, the population is scared of a small group of people because they feel they have a huge aggressive potential, because the small group of people, the dictatorial regime, uses terror, and the population just accepts that the small group of people unilaterally imposes its social contract to society. That's, in a nutshell, a little bit simplistic, what a classical dictatorship is. And a totalitarian state, or a totalitarian state, is based on completely different psychological mechanisms. In a totalitarian state, you first have a strong, powerful process of mass formation, a specific kind of group formation, which makes people fanatically and enthusiastically believe in a certain ideology or a certain narrative, and then you have an elite who uses this fanatic group to seize power in society, and in this way, a completely new kind of state emerged in the 20th century. A state, as Hannah Arendt said, which has a huge secret police at its disposal, namely this part of the population, which believes so fanatically in the state narrative that it is prepared to report each and every one to the state who doesn't go along with the state narrative. So in almost every family, there is someone who fanatically believes in the state narrative, and in this way, you are nowhere safe. That's the reason why a totalitarian state has a much, much more suffocating impact on our mental life and on our psychological functioning than a classical dictatorship. So, around 2017, I started to focus on totalitarianism, on the question of as to what a totalitarian state really is. I started to understand, okay, totalitarianism is always based on mass formation, and it is exactly because this phenomenon of mass formation became stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the last 2 centuries, until it became so strong in the beginning of the 20th century, which was very prophetically predicted by Gustave Le Bon. Gustave Le Bon, one of the first mass psychologists, or one of the first famous mass psychologists, said, the masses and the phenomenon of mass formation becomes stronger, he said, and if it continues to become stronger, we will soon see the emergence of a new kind of state. He said that in 1895, in his famous book, The Psychology of the Crowd, The Psychology of the Mass. He said, if it continues to become stronger, if the masses continue to become stronger, we will soon see the emergence of a new kind of state which is led by the masses. Very prophetically, and about 25 years later, that actually happened. We could see mass formations on an enormous scale happen in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and we could see how certain leaders used these masses to seize control of society, and indeed, as predicted by Le Bon, a new kind of state emerged, the totalitarian state. So, from 2017 onwards, I started to study this phenomenon of totalitarianism, and suddenly then, in 2020, the corona crisis started. From the beginning, literally, from the first weeks onwards, I started to study the statistics a little bit, the statistics on the mortality rates, and I immediately noticed these mortality rates, these statistics are completely wrong. And I published a paper in the first week of the crisis, about the beginning of March, I think, 2020, I published a paper which was titled, "The fear of the virus is more dangerous than the virus itself." I published that paper and I knew immediately, okay, they were already angry with me at university, but they might be more angry now. And to be honest, I was really scared at the moment, because I thought, like, look, if I'm wrong, and if this virus is as dangerous as they said, then they will blame me of thousands and thousands of people dying because I stated as a statistician that the mortality rates were much lower. Now, I was right, because by the end of May 2020, so like the initial statistics, the mathematical models of Imperial College in London predicted that, I always give the same example because it's so clear, these initial models predicted that in a small country such as Sweden, about 60,000 people would die. If the country did, about 60,000 people would die by the end of May 2020 if the country didn't go into lockdown, and the country didn't go into lockdown, and only 6,000 people died. And to arrive at that figure of 6,000, they even had to count in a very enthusiastic way. So it was almost exactly as I had predicted. I could just see that they dramatically overrated the dangerousness of the virus, and when I made my own calculations a little bit, I said, like, they probably overrate the dangerousness with about a factor 10, and it was about such a factor. It became clear by the end of May that indeed the mortality initially had been dramatically overrated. And well, of course, so I had been right, but that didn't matter. They blamed me anyway, that I killed thousands of people. At that moment, like, what I noticed was, and then, like, by the end of May 2020, also very interesting, these researchers at Imperial College who had published the initial mathematical models, they even admitted before the House of Commons in the UK that their initial models had been completely wrong. They admitted it. And even that couldn't change the psychological processes in society. The narrative continued as if the initial models had been completely right. A very strange phenomenon, which prompted me at that moment. I said, like, look, I can continue to try to show people that the statistics are wrong, but it will do something else. I recognized, and from the beginning, I mentioned that in my first opinion paper, I said, look, the statistics are wrong. Everyone blindly follows a narrative that is clearly, utterly absurd, and I see characteristics of the beginning of a totalitarian state in this. I knew by then, already for a long time, that the global institutions tried to replace a democratic system by a technocratic system. You could clearly see it. They were preparing digital IDs, they were preparing digital coins, they had plans to push the population into 5-minute cities, and so on and so on and so on. The global institutions and the global elite, for a long time already, had plans or believed that we urgently needed to replace the democratic system by a technocratic system. They used all kinds of narratives like the climate crisis or the corona crisis to push the population in that direction. That evolution was already there at the level of the elite. But in the corona crisis, we could see for the first time these processes in the population that usually precede the emergence of a fully fledged totalitarian state, the process of mass formation. The real manifestation in open air of a totalitarian state can only happen if the population goes along fanatically with the narratives that are distributed by the totalitarian elite. Without that, a totalitarian system can never start to exist. And from then on, I decided to try to show people what was happening in our society. To a certain extent, that worked a little bit. There were some people who opened their eyes, others didn't. But still, I think that, I will come back to that later on this evening. Still, I think that even if people don't believe us, and even if we cannot wake up people or open up their eyes, we really have to continue to speak out. And I will tell you later on why. So from then on, I decided to write a book. I said, okay, I've been thinking for a long time now about totalitarianism, and it's time now to publish a book about it. And I immediately focused, and I'm happy that I did so, on like the broader cultural, historical, psychological processes which actually lead to totalitarianism, and which all start with this materialist view on man and the world. If you try to find out what the root cause of the problem of totalitarianism is, in my opinion, you will always conclude that the root cause is not so much an evil elite, no matter how evil that elite might be. It's not so much the elite. The root cause is a certain view on man and the world, a certain view on man and the world, the materialist, rationalist view on man and the world, which became dominant after the French Revolution, and which created both a new elite, a new kind of leadership, and a new population. And what many of these things, I have explained many of these things, or I have been describing many of these things in some podcasts, but I will repeat it nevertheless in a nutshell here, because I want to use it to show what we can do about totalitarianism. I think as soon as we really understand the essence of the psychological processes that lead to totalitarianism, we also start to see what we as an individual, which often feels powerless against this enormous propaganda machinery and this blind population in emerging totalitarianism, what we as an individual can do about it if we make the right choice, if we follow the right strategy, if we stick to some eternal ethical principles of humanity. Totalitarianism makes no choice. And that's why I think it's extremely important to understand what the essence of totalitarianism is. If we situate the essence of a totalitarian system in an elite, then we automatically fall prey to the idea that the destruction of the elite is a solution to the problem, which is not true. That's exactly the problem in a totalitarian state. You can destroy a classical dictatorship by attacking the elite, because the essence and the point of gravity of a classical dictatorship is situated in a dictatorial regime. But in a totalitarian system, it makes no sense to try to destroy the elite. The essence of a totalitarian system is an ideological conviction, and the point of gravity of a totalitarian system is situated in the masses which are in the grip of this ideological fanatism. And that's why Stalin, for instance, knew very well that he could, without any problem, eliminate 60–70% of his communist party members, that the system wouldn't collapse. They were just replaced. Everyone was in the grip of the mass formation, and he could kill as many of his communist leaders as he wanted. The system just continued as if nothing happened. The leaders were replaced and the system continued. So I think it's just crucial to understand what the mechanism is behind mass formation and to understand that the real cause of, the root cause of totalitarianism is always situated in a certain view on man and the world, this rationalist view on man and the world. I will try to explain that a little bit. Hannah Arendt said, I think Hannah Arendt for me is one of the most sharp-minded philosophers and thinkers about totalitarianism. She said, the backbone of totalitarianism is a diabolic pact between the elite and the masses. I always remembered that sentence, a diabolic pact between a certain elite and the masses. And the more I studied the psychological mechanisms in a totalitarian state, the more I understood, the more I could provide like a psychological underpinning of that expression. And of this idea that the backbone of totalitarianism is a diabolic pact between the masses, between the elite and the masses. And you can indeed clearly see, as soon as the rationalist, materialist view on man and the world, so this idea that the entire universe is a machine that can be understood in a rational way, you can clearly see that as soon as this idea became dominant, let's say after the French Revolution, and the French Revolution, historically speaking, is the moment where the religious view on man and the world collapsed and was replaced by the rationalist view on man and the world, you could clearly see that immediately after that historical event, a new elite and a new population started to emerge. First, a new elite. Immediately after the French Revolution, the leaders started to understand that they had a problem. The old elite, the noblemen and the clergy, could simply, overtly impose their will to the population. They just decided what the population should do. About, not 100%, but to a large extent, they could just impose their will to the population. So they worked through leaders. And they could lead in this way because the religious view on man and the world stipulated that they could do so. God created certain people to lead, others to follow, and it was like that. Everybody doubted that, nobody really believed it, I guess, but everyone did as if it was true, and that's a characteristic of a dominant view on man and the world. Most people don't really believe it, but they do as if it is true. And it worked. The old elite could impose its will to the population. When this religious view on man and the world collapsed and was replaced by this idea that the universe is not so much a world created by a god, but is like a material phenomenon, the leaders just couldn't impose their will anymore to the population. There was no argument to be found why one human being could say to another that it had the right to tell the other human being what it could do. The new leaders had to be democratically elected from then on, and to be democratically elected, they had to find out what the population wanted, and then trying to give them what they wanted, or otherwise they wouldn't be elected, and they wouldn't be re-elected. Definitely not. So, in other words, rather than imposing their will to the population, the new leaders had to follow the will of the population. So the new leaders had become followers. And that's the moment where modern propaganda started. Immediately after the French Revolution, we often forget that, nobody seems to have noticed that. At least I've never read it somewhere. Immediately after the French Revolution, the first institute for modern propaganda was established. Propaganda existed before. The church used propaganda, but it was of a completely different nature than the modern propaganda that emerged after the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, in France, the first institute of propaganda was established. The name of this institute was Le Bureau d'Opinion Publique, the Office for Public Opinion. And from then on, the leaders started to understand something. And you can read this line of reasoning in the works of all the founding fathers of modern propaganda. You can read it everywhere. They said, okay, we have a problem. We cannot impose our will anymore to the population. That means that we will fall prey to the destructive and irrational tendencies in the population, and to a certain extent they were true. The population, insofar as it formed a mass, was destructive and was irrational at certain moments, and so the leaders said, we have a problem. We cannot impose our will anymore, we will fall prey to the destructiveness and the irrationality of the population and the masses. So, and they made a certain decision there. They said, we have only one chance. We have to make sure that the population does what we want them to do, without them knowing that they do what we want them to do. In other words, we have to constantly manipulate them. That was the moment when modern propaganda was born. You can read that in every work of the founding fathers of propaganda. I can recommend you, for instance, the work of Edward Bernays on propaganda. He literally articulates this line of reasoning there. We constantly have to manipulate them, or otherwise we will fall prey to the population. And that's how it happened. So, starting from the French Revolution onwards, propaganda became ever more important. It took a huge leap forward during the First World War, and then after the First World War, all these propaganda techniques and all this propaganda machinery that had been established or created during the First World War to make people go to the battlefield didn't disappear after the First World War. It was used during peacetime for commercial reasons, and then when the Second World War started, propaganda became even much more important, and again, after the Second World War, the propaganda was used again during peacetime to manipulate the population, and now it became ever more important after the Second World War. Until now, we literally live in a public space which is constantly saturated with propaganda without us knowing it. For instance, a search engine such as Google is the perfect propaganda tool. The perfect propaganda tool. It is also developed by the State Department in America. It's developed. Larry Page got a grant of the State Department to create Google. And once you understand how propaganda works, you can see that Google is the perfect propaganda tool. What is propaganda? On the one hand, it's the art of lying. It was like a new kind of lie which emerged after the French Revolution. A new kind of lie. People have always been lying. As long as mankind exists, people have been lying. But propaganda was a new kind of lie. A kind of lie which is based on academic research, on mass psychology, a kind of lie also which is industrialized. There is like an entire industry of propaganda, and the kind of lie which is ideologically justified. Within this rationalist ideology, the leaders have to lie. It is almost their ethical duty to manipulate the population. So there was like a new kind of lie which emerged, and but maybe even more than the art of lying, or than the discipline of lying, propaganda is the art of directing people's attention. Like someone like Goebbels in Nazi Germany said, you have to lie as little as possible. Don't lie too much. It's better not to lie, he said, because lies can be discovered. It's better to just focus people's attention on something and keep the attention away on something else. So you make sure that people see one thing in reality and that they don't see the rest of reality. That's actually what propaganda tries to do. And something like Google is the perfect instrument for that. Google uses all kinds of algorithms, and every time we try to find the answer to a question, every time we consult Google, Google makes sure that we find the answer that state ideology wants us to find, and that we will never try to find the answer in a different direction. So Steve Kirsch, an American billionaire, once made a small YouTube movie showing how the search results on Google, how the results when someone searches my name on Google are manipulated. He made this movie and he showed, like, look, all the negative results come first, and then, like on page 120, you find some of the positive information about me. So that's one thing. Certain people, they just make sure that when you use Google, you find in the first place negative information. But it happens in all these algorithms. Like I can recommend you a very interesting interview, an interview of Tucker Carlson with Mike Pence, who worked at the State Department in America and had the cyber portfolio, who was the director of the cyber portfolio. He explains in detail how most applications on the internet are used for propaganda ends. A very interesting interview. One of the most important, I think, of the last year. So at this moment, we live in a public space, as I said, in which the state, or in any case, the people who are in control in the society constantly use propaganda. The major tool in our society to keep control of society is psychological manipulation. And which is strange, of course, because in the beginning of the tradition of enlightenment, like immediately after the French Revolution, the Enlightenment philosophers believed that finally we would create a society in which truth prevailed. They believed that the previous leaders led on the basis of all kinds of illusionary narratives, religious narratives, mythical narratives, and so on, and now the leaders would lead society on the basis of scientific, true knowledge. In other words, on the basis of truth. And exactly the opposite happened. Exactly the opposite happened. We ended up in a society in which the leaders limitlessly and excessively used manipulation and lies to control society. Something very strange. I can also recommend, like, one of the books of Aldous Huxley. You know Aldous Huxley. He wrote this dystopic novel, Brave New World. But he wrote the second book, Brave New World Revisited. And in this Brave New World Revisited, he says that he expects that after a few decades, we would end up in a societal system, in a society, which on the surface would look exactly like a democracy. There would be a parliament, a court where you could go to, and so on. And he said, and every broadcast in the news and every article in the newspapers will be about how important democracy is. But under the surface, he says, you can find it on my Twitter page, literally, under the surface, he says, you will find a fully fledged totalitarian system in which a few oligarchs rule with the help of an impressive military and police apparatus, and, he said, an army of mind manipulators. That's wonderful. If you read it now, you can almost not imagine that it is written in 1952. But indeed, in a strange way, exactly the opposite happened than what most Enlightenment philosophers expected. They expected that finally we would end up in a society where the truth prevailed, where leaders ruled on the basis of truth, and if you read people like Immanuel Kant, and exactly the opposite happened, and if you read people like Immanuel Kant and his famous manifesto, his text which is titled What is Enlightenment? You see how Kant expects there that not only, well, he doesn't mention that in the text, that not only the leaders would lead on the basis of truth, but that there would also emerge a population which thinks critically and which is capable of thinking critically of what the leaders tell them to do, and also at that level, exactly the opposite happened. Rather than that there emerged the population which had the capacity to think critically, a population emerged which blindly bought into even the most absurd narratives. That's exactly what we could observe. The population fell prey to propaganda in a completely blind way, without any capacity to take a critical distance and to think about what about the narratives that were spread, for instance, through the mass media. So how did it happen? Because I just described how a new elite emerged, an elite who excessively used propaganda to keep control, but also at the level of the population, and that is a far less known phenomenon. Also at the level of the population, profound changes happened. The population changed. So what was, for instance, what was very striking was that as soon as the materialist and the rationalist view of men in the world became dominant, you could see how more and more people started to feel lonely and disconnected. I explained that in the first chapters of my book. You can understand that purely on a psychological level. A rationalist view of men in the world, as soon as you start to believe that the essence of life is rational, you disconnect from life. If you try to grasp everything around you, nature around you, other people around you, and the categories of your rational thinking, you stop resonating with your environment because the essence of life is not rational. So you get alienated from the phenomena around you. You can explain that in detail, I won't do it now. And so, but that's one direct reason why a rationalist attitude in life leads to a certain disconnection, but there's also an indirect trace, like if you the rationalist view of men in the world led to the excessive industrialization and mechanization of the world and to the excessive use of technology. And we often think that technology connects us to each other, which is true. At the level of information exchange, technology connects us to each other. But at the level of resonance, technology disconnects us to each other. The more we replaced real in-person conversations by by conversations through digital means, for instance, the less our bodies, literally, I'll tell something more about that later on, the less our bodies and our souls really resonate with each other, and hence we feel more disconnected. You can understand that logically, but you can also see it empirically. Like just before the corona crisis, the number of lonely and disconnected people peaked just before the corona crisis, somewhere in between 40 and 60% of the world population declared to feel lonely to the extent that they didn't have one meaningful relationship with another human being, and that they only connected to each other through the internet. In between 40 and 60%. Theresa May recognized the extent of the problem, and she appointed a Minister of Loneliness in the UK. I don't think it will have made a big difference, but she did. It shows that the problem was recognized. And the US surgeon in America declared that there was a loneliness epidemic. So there's a huge number of people who feel lonely. And you can explain that in numerous ways. Enfin, I won't do it, but if you read my next book, you will find it there. and this loneliness, so this materialist view of man in the world, made more and more people feel lonely. Even in the beginning of the 19th century, people such as Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, observed that already. And they said already, like, it is strange, but our society is atomizing. There are more and more atomized people. People who are not connected, who are like isolated, like an elementary particle, who are not connecting anymore to the rest of, to other people. So it was already there, that phenomenon existed already early in the 19th century, but now, like 200 years later, it's exponentially much more there than it used to be in the beginning of the 19th century. So more and more people feel lonely, disconnected, and as a consequence of loneliness and disconnectedness, you immediately see that more and more people start to struggle with profound feelings of lack of meaning-making and lack of purpose in life. If someone gets lonely, if you disconnect from nature around you, if you disconnect from the other people around you, automatically and spontaneously, you will start to struggle with lack of meaning-making. As a human being, we feel purpose in our lives at the moment we see that our existence has an effect on the other. If we see that emotions on the face of someone else, because of our existence, we spontaneously, automatically have the feeling that our life has meaning. And if we don't see that we have an effect on the other, we spontaneously, automatically have the feeling that our existence is senseless, without purpose. So lonely people, after a while, usually start to struggle with lack of meaning making. Also, that was clear. Like just before the corona crisis, you could clearly see that there were many people struggling with lack of meaning making. For instance, up to 60% of the world population reported that they considered their own job to be a so-called bullshit job, a job without any meaning. Try to imagine that. Up to 60% of the people goes to work every day having the feeling that what they do actually makes no sense at all. And something very, very important, I didn't mention that, is that the number of people feeling lonely, disconnected, and without purpose and meaning in life is almost perfectly correlated with the level of technology used in a country. The more technology that is used in a country, the more people feel lonely, and the more people struggle with lack of meaning making, something extremely important. It shows us like technology, the excessive use of technology is really, I think, one of the most problematic things in our society. I forgot my iPhone today, and I'm very happy. It was one of the best days I've had in the last 2 months. It's also because I'm surrounded by so many lovely and beautiful people and such a beautiful landscape, but I'm sure that the forgetting of my iPhone also contributes to the quality of the day. Yeah, what was it? Let me see. Okay, I was about to say something and I forgot it. So,
the meaning.
Use of technology, meaning, lack of meaning making, yes, lack of purpose. Doesn't matter. What? Yes. Well, most jobs are without purpose or meaning, and indeed, which is no, it was something else. Doesn't matter. I will continue.
Bullshit job.
Bullshit Jobs, yes. It's a book that I really can... Do you know the book Bullshit Jobs? It's written by David Graeber. It's wonderful. He died 2 years ago. He wrote another wonderful book just before he died. It was even not published when he died. The title of that book is The Beginning of Everything. It's a wonderful book in which he explains how Native Americans, the Indians of Northeast America, could organize a society without power structures, just because they practiced the art of sincere speech constantly. I will come back to this later on. I'll first continue my line of reasoning now. So, many people started to feel lonely, many people started to feel disconnected, many people started to feel, to struggle with lack of meaning making and purpose, and that all had to do with the fact that most people, or with the fact that more and more, the world was more and more industrialized, we used more and more mechanical devices, that as well, like the use of mechanical devices without us knowing it has a profound negative psychological impact. Like we often do not realize that, but for instance, the use of a mechanical device as simple as a watch has a very profound, deep psychological impact. Before people used watches, they had to orientate in time, they had to make appointments on the basis of the cycles of nature, the cycles of the sun, cycles of the moon, the stars, and so on and so on. So without them knowing it, they constantly, mentally connected to nature around them. They were constantly connected with the cycles of nature. After the introduction of watches, that stopped. You can say that this is something minor, something that is not important, but it is important. If you could just project the stream of images that constantly goes through our mind on a screen, and watch that stream of images like a movie, you would see that after the introduction of a watch, the stream of images that goes through our mind considerably, significantly contained less images of nature around us. Huh? And like the introduction of navigation systems in our car, that's also something very clear for me. Switch it off for 1 week, and you will see how your mind connects again to your environment. You will start to develop a mental map of your country, for instance. And you will feel mentally much more connected and much more in control. You will feel how your mind literally attaches again to the real environment. Yeah? So anyway, this entire mechanization, industrialization, use of technology led to an atomization of the world, more and more lonely people, and in the end, much more lack of meaning, making and purpose. And then, after that, something important happens. Once someone feels lonely and disconnected, once he is confronted with lack of purpose and meaning making, a very important change happens at the level of his affective, emotional functioning. And it is that once someone is disconnected, he starts to struggle typically with so-called, what I called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. So he will be confronted with a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression which is not connected to a mental representation. He will be confronted with anxiety, for instance. He will be anxious without knowing what he feels anxious for. And that is a terrible, aversive mental state. If you are anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you feel completely out of control. It's one of the most aversive mental states. You feel completely out of control. You cannot protect yourself from the object of your anxiety. No. And that's the point where we can start to understand why this state, this disconnected, purposeless state, this state in which people are confronted with lack of meaning-making, with free-floating, uncontrollable anxiety, frustration and aggression, this state, strangely enough, is a state where a human being is extremely vulnerable and sensitive to propaganda. So we see like a very strange, we see two processes which developed together throughout the last 2 years. On the one hand, an elite which excessively used propaganda, and on the other hand, a population which became more and more sensitive to propaganda. How does that work? In a very simple way. As soon as, you know, people have always been anxious, always. In medieval times they were anxious as well. But the difference was that before the French Revolution and before modernity, people had the illusion that they knew what they were anxious of. They were anxious of the devil, of demons, doesn't matter of what, but they had the illusion that their anxiety was connected to a mental representation. And in modernity, and during the tradition of enlightenment, people started to be confronted with much higher levels of free-floating anxiety. And in this state, the only thing that has to happen is the distribution or dissemination of a narrative that indicates an object of anxiety in order for a mass formation to emerge. Or there is a good chance that it might emerge. So if there is a lot of free-floating anxiety in society, and someone distributes, intentionally or not intentionally, a narrative through the mass media indicating an object of anxiety and providing a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, then there is a good chance that all this free-floating anxiety will connect to the object of anxiety, for instance a virus, or the Jews in Nazi Germany, or no matter what, the witches during the witch hunts, or you can give many examples. There's a good chance that all this free-floating anxiety will connect to the object of anxiety, and that there will be a huge willingness in the population to go along, to participate in the strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, even if that strategy is utterly absurd. That's the point. People go along with the narrative, not because they think it is true, but because it allows them the narrative, no matter how absurd it might be, to control their anxiety and to take out all their frustration and aggression to something, namely that object of anxiety, or those who seem to collaborate with that object of anxiety. For instance, the anti-vaxxers. Yeah, but that's it. It's one thing. You can see clearly human beings are not rational beings. Not at all. They are emotional, affective, irrational beings. Just like I said, nature and the human being is not rational at all. It's a human being in the first place as an emotional human being who tries to find a way to regulate his emotions. And it's only on the surface that it creates a little bit the illusion of rationality. And it's that what is so clear. A mass formation shows that clearly. The narrative, from a rational point of view, might be completely absurd, and I don't think there has ever been a more absurd narrative, in my opinion, than the corona narrative. I won't go into that now, but I think it was really absurd. And still, it didn't make a difference. Just because it worked. It worked, it worked. It allowed people to be under the illusion that now they knew what they were anxious for, and that now they could control their anxiety by participating in a certain strategy. That is the first step. That's the first step of a mass formation. People attach all their anxiety to an object of anxiety, and they start to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, which makes them enthusiastic, fanatically believing in the narrative in a strange way, no matter how absurd it is. And also in a second step, it makes them radically willing to self-sacrifice for the narrative. That's something that was described by Gustave Le Bon from the 19th century onwards. As soon as people are in the grip of a mass formation, they are willing to self-sacrifice. They are willing to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them, their health, their wealth, the future of their children. Their children doesn't matter. They want to sacrifice everything for the narrative. And the third step, and you can understand it when I give the rest of the explanation of the phenomenon of mass formation. And in a third step, they become radically intolerant for everyone who thinks differently. Radically intolerant. That happens in the next step, indeed. Like first, people attach all their anxiety to the object of anxiety, and then, because so many people at the same time start to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, they have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle. In Belgium, the army of 11 million people who will fight the corona crisis. That was what our Prime Minister said. So it's this second step, like the feeling that they fight the collective heroic battle, which is the most important characteristic of a mass formation. It's that what makes a mass formation so intoxicating, so attractive. And you could see it like people in the hospitals. You can, if you see these videos again now, it's so strange. They were dancing together, clapping their hands, and so on and so on. They were never had been more happy than when this terrible virus was unleashed. So they have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle with the object of anxiety, and in other words, they have the feeling that they escape their loneliness. That's the root cause of the problem at the psychological level, the loneliness. People have the feeling that the mass formation liberates them from their loneliness. That's the point. So you have a very specific state, a state in which people are literally hypnotized by an object of anxiety, literally. All their emotions and affects connect to this one object of anxiety. They are literally hypnotized. A hypnotic procedure is a procedure in which someone's attention is focused very much on one aspect of reality, and in which he doesn't realize anymore, in which he doesn't see the rest of reality anymore. That's exactly what happens in a mass formation. We could see that very clearly, I think, during the corona crisis. The only thing that people could see was the danger of the virus, for instance, and they absolutely were no longer aware of the danger of the measures themselves. So it's this state where the attention of someone is focused on one aspect of reality, and where he starts to have the feeling to be connected again to other people, to fight a collective heroic war together. It's this state which seems to free someone of his loneliness and of his disconnectedness. I say seems to free someone, because they are not really connected again. A mass formation disconnects people even more from each other. That's the main characteristic of a mass. So a mass formation is a kind of group formation, and Sigmund Freud, he wrote one text about mass formation, but it was enough, this one text, to grasp the essence of mass formation, to understand what the difference is between a normal group formation and a mass formation. The main characteristic of a mass formation is that the mass is a group which emerges because Each individual separately connects to a collective ideal. In a mass, people do not connect to each other. They connect to a collective ideal, a collective struggle, for instance. In a mass, everyone is talking about solidarity, but the solidarity is not a solidarity with other individuals, it's a solidarity with a collective ideal. And the longer the mass formation exists, the more all the love and solidarity is sucked away from the bond between individuals and is injected in the bond between the individual and the collective. And in the end, people feel much more solidarity with the collective than with their fellow human beings. Now, you could see that in the corona crisis very clearly. Everyone was talking about solidarity with the elderly, for instance, but at the same time they accepted that if their father and mother were dying in a hospital, they were no longer allowed to visit them. So, why not? Because we have to be we show solidarity with the collective ideal of fighting the virus, okay? That's the difference. Solidarity in a mass is always solidarity with the collective and not with another human being. And the longer the mass formation exists, the less love they feel for each other, the more for the collective. And in the end stage of mass formation, this leads to a state where children report their parents to the state, where they feel less solidarity with their parents than with the state, and where mothers or fathers report their children to the state. You can find a conversation on the internet of me with Shoref Eshtali, a woman who lived in the upper class of Iran in the revolution there of 1978, 1979, and she, as a member of the upper class, she had to witness every Friday evening, I think, how traders were killed on a square in Tehran. And one day she said, I saw how a mother had reported her son to the state, how the mother hung the noose around the neck of the son, and when he died on the scaffold, she received a medal for being a heroine who reported her son to the state. That's the dramatic end stage of mass formation. It sucks away all love between individuals, even the love of a mother for her child, and replaces it, injects it in the love for a collective ideal. Stalin killed millions and millions and millions of people. Almost in every family he killed people, but when he died, people were lining up and weeping, 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 because their beloved leader died. That's where you can see how much in a totalitarian state the love between people is replaced by the love for the collective ideal. And in every totalitarian state, this collective ideal is embodied and represented, usually after a while, by one person. They call that a cult of personality in a totalitarian state. For instance, Stalin, Hitler, who represent this collective ideal. So that's the end stage of mass formation. It's a symptomatic solution for loneliness. A symptomatic solution for loneliness. Symptomatic because it's not a real solution. After mass formation, you see how people are even more lonely than before. And that's why the one mass formation is usually very soon replaced by another. Once one mass formation stops, usually you see the emergence of a second one. Because people feel even more lonely and you're even more sensitive for a new narrative that indicates an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. As soon as the corona narrative lost its power, the Ukraine narrative came. As soon as the Ukraine narrative lost its power, the Israel narrative came, and so on. You will see there is a good chance that for a while we will never be without a narrative which indicates one big object of anxiety is. So that's just... You can also see it clearly at a different level. Somewhere back in February 2022, I guess, students were allowed to come to university again. People could go to work again. People were allowed to go to cultural events again, but nobody showed up. Only 5% of the students came to university. Most felt even much more lonely than before, and they just stayed where they are, lonely in their homes. Okay, so now, what can we do about it? That's the point. That's the most important thing. What can we do about it? As soon as you start to understand what happens in a totalitarian state, I really believe we have had the fascist totalitarianism of the beginning of the 20th century. We have had the communist totalitarianism, and I really believe that we are witnessing now the emergence of a new, fully fledged totalitarian state, which is a global totalitarian state. It's a velvet glove totalitarianism up until now. You don't really feel it. The ultimate totalitarianism, Huxley said, is a totalitarian state in which people even don't know that they are not free. They are convinced that they are free, but while they are convinced that they are free, they do exactly what the state wants. That's the ultimate totalitarian state, in which the indoctrination and propaganda is so successful that you even don't need terror to make people do what the state wants. And after a while, the totalitarian state always becomes aggressive and uses terror, but not in the initial stages. So I think we are dealing with a new technocratic totalitarianism, now a totalitarianism in which the transhumanist ideology is the underlying motivator. And indeed, we have to ask ourselves, when being confronted with this, what can we do about it? Well, as soon as, in the 19th century, certain scholars started to understand the phenomenon of mass formation, the most important, I think, in the 19th century was Gustave Le Bon, in his book, The Psychology of the Crowds. He noticed, and he mentions that every time a mass formation emerges, there is a certain group of people who do not fall prey to it. So there are people, for one reason or another, who do not fall prey to the mass formation. Nobody knows exactly why, but there is always a group who doesn't fall prey to it. And the people who really fall prey to it, their percentage is rather low. It's usually not much more than 20 to 30%. So, but there is then 70, 75% of the people who just feel that there is something wrong with the narrative, but who will never have the courage to step up and speak out against the narrative. So every time a large mass formation emerges, there is a group of people who doesn't fall prey to it, and who tries to wake up the other people and try to show them how absurd the narrative is where they believe in. For certain reasons, the narratives that lead to mass formation always become absurd after a while. There is no other option, because the field of attention is so narrow that the narrative cannot else than become absurd. And this small group of people, Gustave Le Bon said, this small group of people will usually try to wake the other people up, show them how absurd the narrative is where they believe in, but Gustave Le Bon said, this small group of people usually will not succeed in waking them up. Mass formation is an extremely powerful kind of hypnosis, and usually the people that are in the grip of the mass formation, or people who are not in the grip of the mass formation, won't be capable of waking up those who are in. But, and that's something extremely important, crucial, Gustave Le Bon says, the fact that the people who do not fall prey to the mass formation do not succeed in waking up the masses does not mean that their speech has no effect. That speech makes that the mass formation does not go to the ultimate stage. That speech makes that the mass hypnosis does not become so deep that the masses start to become convinced that they have to eliminate each and every one of the people who do not go along with them. That's typically the end stage of a mass formation. When people are in the last stage of the mass formation, they are so obsessed, so in the grip of the narrative, that they really believe that everyone who doesn't go along with the narrative is like mad, inhumane, shows no solidarity, and deserves no better than being destroyed. And that's, Gustave Le Bon remarks, that if there are people who continue to speak out, and who continue to say there is something wrong with that narrative, usually the masses do not go to the ultimate stage. Stopping to speak out when there is a major mass formation is fatal. And history has shown it very clearly. Like in 1930, in the Soviet Union, the resistance decided to go underground and to stop to speak out in public space. Within 6 months, the destruction campaign started. In 1935, exactly the same happened in Nazi Germany. The resistance went underground. Within 6 months, I don't know, might have been a year in the Nazi Germany, the destruction campaign started. History shows it very clearly. It can be very clever to stop to speak out when you are confronted with a classical dictatorship. But if you are confronted with a totalitarian state, and you stop to speak out, you're dead. And we have to do it quickly enough. Once the totalitarian process goes over a certain limit, it's over. But if you continue to speak out, there is a good chance that the totalitarian system, the totalitarian state, will destroy itself before it destroys you. And that's one major tactical principle. Totalitarianism. Thank you. Totalitarianism is always intrinsically self-destructive. Almost everyone who has been studying totalitarianism has remarked that there is something intrinsically self-destructive in a totalitarian system. But the point is that you have to make sure that the system destroys itself before it destroys you, of course. And that's why we have to stick to the first and most important ethical principles. I think I will not go too deep into that, but I think the most important thing to understand is that totalitarianism is equal to a complete loss of ethical awareness in a population. And the only remedy against totalitarianism is to stick to ethical principles. The people who do not go along with it shouldn't think too rationally about what they should do. In the first place, they should realize that they have to stay loyal to ethical principles. Now, that's the most important thing. And the first of these ethical principles is to live up to the ethical duty to speak in a sincere way. That's the first ethical principle we should always try to live up to. Totalitarianism tries to kill the soul of the people. It tries to replace the soul by one totalitarian identity. And if you continue to speak out, sincere speech, I will go into that in a moment. Sincere speech is exactly this kind of speech which comes from the soul, from what you feel within, and which makes your soul stronger. So, no matter from where you look at the phenomenon, you can clearly see living up to ethical principles, sincerity, is the first and most important strategical and tactical principle to follow when you're confronted with totalitarianism. Yeah. No. I don't need water. Yes.
Maybe water needs
yes, so that's important. You have to continue to speak out, and now the question, of course, is, it doesn't matter how you speak out. Not every kind of speech is as effective. Not at all. There are certain kinds of speech who even speed up the process of... How long am I talking now? Because I always lose my awareness of time.
We are in eternity now.
What? Give me 15 more minutes, and I will finish.
Just right.
How should we speak out? That's what my next book is about. The Psychology of Truth. That won't be the title, but it's about the psychology of truth. You can clearly see, I said, no matter from what perspective you look at it, the real crisis we find ourselves in, and the disease of totalitarianism, essentially consists of the fact that as a society and as a culture, we lost touch with truth. That's very strange. The pursuit of rationality made people lose touch with what truth is. And we live in a society which is sick of this new kind of lie, which we call propaganda. And the only remedy is not counter-propaganda. People sometimes ask me that, like, should we not use counter-propaganda to break the power of propaganda? I really don't believe so. Exactly the opposite holds true. I think that our answer must be sincerity. And I think that that is our major challenge, and a task now is to rediscover and to reappreciate the crucial importance of the phenomenon of truth for a human being. The better you understand, but you shouldn't be naive. It's very difficult to determine what truth exactly is. If we think naively about truth, we lost it already. If we think we can possess the truth, for instance, we lost it already. Truth is something we can resonate with for a moment, but you can never possess it. And, you know, maybe I will tell a little bit about how a child that is born experiences language. Like, when a child is born, it immediately, even from before it is born, resonates with the voice of the mother. Immediately after birth, it can recognize the voice of the mother already from all other voices. And there are beautiful experiments, good experiments. There are certain psychological experiments which have value. There are good experiments which show that beyond a shade of doubt. And more than that, a child can not only recognize the voice of the mother, it can imitate it immediately. The crying of a child immediately after birth shows already the same musical characteristics of the voice of the mother. And so a child, even in the womb, before it is born, resonates with the mother's voice. And after birth, this resonance continues. A child will imitate the form language, the facial expressions, and the sounds the mother makes. And while it is doing so, it constantly, psychologically, connects with the mother. It feels the mother in the most direct way. It feels its environment in the most direct way. It resonates, a young child resonates perfectly with the world around it. Perfectly. It feels what the other feels. You cannot deceive a young child. It resonates from core to core. It feels what you feel. When it reaches the age of 6 months old, a young child knows the truth of the family system it is born in perfectly, even much better than the adults around it, because it resonates. This resonance leads also to an impressive learning capacity in the child. A young child can learn to distinguish all phonemes, all elementary sounds of all the languages in the world in 2 weeks' time. For a grown-up, it's almost impossible to distinguish all the phonemes of all the languages in the world. He cannot learn to distinguish these phonemes in his entire lifetime. A child has such a subtle capacity to resonate with sound outside of itself that it has a tremendous learning potential. And it is this, this resonance leads to an enormous resonating capacity, empathic capacity. A child feels, has an enormous capacity to feel empathy for someone else. If a child looks at another child that drops to the ground and that hurts itself, it will often start to cry itself. So a child, on the basis of its capacity to resonate, has a huge capacity to feel empathy for someone else. This state in which a child resonates with not only the social world around it, but also with the material world, is a state that, as an adult, we can almost not imagine anymore, except in certain very exceptional, under certain very exceptional circumstances. If we use mescaline, for instance, like the natural variant of LSD, we get in this state again. People who use mescaline will report exactly this. They start to resonate, they start to feel the world around them, they become the other persons around them, they even become the material objects around them, and they feel them from within, just like a little child. And also the mystical experiences were exactly this. People reported that the mystics, the great mystics, reported that they had the capacity to become the other persons with whom they were talking, for instance. Aldous Huxley to refer to him again, has written a wonderful book about that. The Doors of Perception is the title of the book, and the famous 60s group, The Doors, is named after the title of that book, The Doors of Perception. And in The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley describes exactly this, the experiences when you use mescaline, and he remarks that they are exactly the same experiences as the mystics reported. And both the mescaline experience and the experience, the mystical experience, show this major characteristics. The first thing that happens when you use mescaline, what happens during a mystical experience is exactly that your ego disappears. And that's what a young child also has. A young child, younger than 6 months, has no ego. It has no ego yet. The ego structure emerges when a child is in between 6 and 9 months old. What happens then? At that moment, somewhere in between 6 and 9 months, a child starts to recognize itself in the mirror. For a child recognizes itself for the first time in the mirror, usually in a very specific situation, when it sits on the arm of the mother, and the mother points to the mirror and says, "Look, that is you." For certain reasons, which I won't describe now, can a child then, for the first time, start to realize that the image in the mirror is its own image. And at that moment, something very specific happens. A child starts to laugh in a very enthusiastic way when it recognizes itself for the first time in the mirror. And the reason is because the mother usually points with happiness, enthusiasm in the mirror. She says, "Look, that's you." That makes that what the child sees in the mirror is not merely its own image, its self-image, it's also the ideal image of the other. So what the child experiences when it recognizes itself for the first time in the mirror is the disappearance of the gap between the self-image and the ideal image of the other. In other words, what the child experiences when it recognizes itself for the first time in the mirror is the first narcissistic satisfaction. Yes? The first time it says, "That's me, and I am the ideal object of the other." A child starts to laugh at the moment because it feels so much enjoyment, and it usually, for the rest of his life, tries to reproduce that initial narcissistic experience. Every time we look in the mirror, we hope a little bit that what we will see there will be the ideal image of the other. Okay? And from then on, something very specific happens. The child, in the first months of its life, resonated from core to core. The strings of its body vibrated together with the strings of the bodies of the other people around it. All the attention of the child was focused on the inner resonating processes in the body, and from then on that changes. All the psychological attention is sucked away from the core of the body and is invested in the surface of the body. The child from then on is obsessed by the question to what extent it looks like the ideal image. And that's the moment where all the attention of the child starts to be absorbed by the outer ideal image and by the matrix of social rules which describe what it should do to embody that ideal image. So from then on, a child starts to be obsessed by the question, who do I have to be loved by the other? That's the moment where the ego structure is born, and that's the moment where a child loses its sincerity a little bit. And at every moment, we feel that in our lives. I tell it because it tells us something about what truth speech is. Every moment we open our mouth and start to speak, we make that fundamental choice. We can speak in such a way that it seems as if we embody the ideal image. In that case, we constantly are thinking what we need to say in order to be approved by the other. And when we speak sincerely, we do the opposite. We do not care too much about what the other wants us to say. We just connect to our own vibrating, resonating body, which is like an antenna, which resonates with everything around us. We connect with what we feel inside, and we just choose to articulate it, no matter what the consequences are in the world of appearances. And every time we do that, our soul becomes stronger and our ego becomes weaker. Literally. Sincere speech makes the ego stronger. It makes that the energy makes the soul stronger and makes the ego weaker. It makes that the energy which is invested in the outer ideal image and the matrix of social rules goes back to our inner resonating core again. It's this kind of speech which literally penetrates through the ego, which literally penetrates through what I often call the veil of appearances. It's this kind of speech which is true speech, which is sincere speech, and which has the capacity to connect people from soul to soul, and that's what we feel. Truth speech is always vulnerable speech. The ancient Greeks knew that already. Every time you speak the truth, you're vulnerable. People will be angry with you, for instance, and you also will feel vulnerable because you show exactly this, what makes you not match the ideal image. That's, if you want to speak sincerely, you have to try to feel where your weakest, most vulnerable point is and speak from that point. That's truth speech is always vulnerable speech. If you speak in this way, you penetrate through the veil of appearances, and you have a chance that the person who will listen to you opens up his own ideal image, opens up his own ego, and allows your sincere words to enter his own embodied soul. And in that case, if he does so, if you have someone who has the courage to speak sincerely, and someone who has the integrity to listen in a sincere way, the two embodied souls literally starts to tremble and vibrate on the same frequency, on the sincere frequency, and you get connection, you feel that. If you are in a group of people, and someone says something that makes him really vulnerable, something of which you know, someone says something that is usually hidden behind the wall of outer appearances. As someone speaks in such a sincere way, you will feel a vibrating silence and you will feel connection. You will feel a real group. Sincere speech is the true solution to the problem of loneliness and disconnectedness. It reconnects. It takes away the root cause of the mass formation and totalitarianism, and it inhibits immediately also the mass formation itself. So that's, I'm sure, the better you understand the psychology of truth, the better you understand that what we are going through at this moment is really a metaphysical revolution. It's a process in which a society which is led or which believes in the illusion of rational understanding is being replaced by a society which centers on sincerity and truth. And what happens at the psychological level is exactly this. We are seeing now a field of tension between, on the one hand, a mass in the grip of propaganda, of sophisticated lies, and on the other hand, we see the emergence of a real group of people connected from individual to individual through sincerity, which resonate on the same frequency. I can feel it almost physically. I go so much I travel around the world, and everywhere I feel that people go through the same process. Everywhere I see, 2 years ago, people are all focusing on Klaus Schwab and on the World Economic Forum and so on and so on. And yes, of course, we have to invest a little bit of energy in understanding Klaus Schwab, but not too much. I see that more and more people now start to become aware of the importance of sincerity and truth speech. Like the alternative movement, no matter how you call it, the resistance movement, doesn't matter. It's very divided internally. You see a lot of conflict, and that's because they function to the same old principle. We fall prey to the illusion that what connects us should be the same opinion. That is not true. A group that is connected and unified by opinion is a mass, of course. In a mass, everyone has to think the same. In a real group, in which people are really connected to each other as individuals, your opinion is only of secondary importance. It's even the case that the more the other think differently, the more you will love him. Because the more he can really learn you something as a human being. If someone is identical, someone who is identical cannot learn you something new. And if you love someone only because he thinks just like you and because he looks just like you, what you love is not the other. It's your own mirror image, and what you feel is not love, it's narcissism. So, and as soon as this group of people, no matter who feels that there is something wrong with this dominant kind of society, as soon as this group of people really is unified by sincerity, as soon as this group becomes energetically more powerful than the propagandized masses, the era of totalitarianism is over. That's the point. When you realize that we can all contribute every time we speak a sincere word, be it on a television program, be it on the radio, be it on the market, be it on the street, or at the kitchen table, it doesn't matter. Every time we speak a sincere word, every time we have the courage to show something that is usually hidden behind the world of appearances, we create true connection from soul to soul. And every time, at that moment, we overcome totalitarianism. That's something very important to understand. We all have power. Society as a psychological system is a complex dynamical system. And one characteristic of complex dynamical systems is that a minor change in one detail of the system changes the entire system. And that holds true for society and for speech as well. Every time we speak a sincere word, no matter how small, you have to take that literally. In a pot of boiling water, a change in the vibration state of one molecule of the water changes the entire convection pattern in the water. In exactly the same way, every time we can become a little bit more sincere, we change the entire society. So we all can contribute to a solution, and we do contribute if we try to become more sincere and more aware of sincereness. Mahatma Gandhi is one of the people who has shown us in a magnificent way what the power of sincerity is. You have to read, if you want, the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, which is called, I bought it like, I don't know, 2 years ago or something, because I started to understand that non-violent resistance is the only internal resistance that is effective and when confronted with emerging totalitarianism. And as soon as I opened the book, I was happily surprised to see that the title of the book was Experiments on Truth, and that Gandhi said from the first pages onwards, the essence of all non-violent resistance is sincerity and sincere speech. And his entire life, Gandhi tried to make progress, to become more sincere. He practiced it in a simple way, an almost naive, childish way. He practiced the art of sincere speech. I give workshops about that now. Hundreds of people have followed them in Belgium and Holland. Like the art of speech, the art of sincere speech. And I love it myself because I feel how much it changes your life. Gandhi has shown us what the power is. Gandhi said, in the first chapters of his book, I don't know exactly where, he said, I had no major talent at all. I was not handsome. I was not physically strong. I was not intelligent at school. I was not a good writer, and I was not a good speaker. But this man, without any major talent, inherited a power that even the most powerful army in the world didn't have at the moment. He kicked out the English of India. That's what we have to realize. In the end, simple sincerity, the oldest act humanity has ever done, speaking in a sincere way, will prove more powerful than even the most impressive propaganda machinery in the world. Voilà, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Mattias, for this absolutely wonderful and impactful speech. I'm sure that, true to your words, it has resonated with everybody here.
Dag Professor, groetjes van Thuisfront in Gent. I'll ask my question in English. I'm... Sorry, yeah, I'll stand.
Stand up, please.
Yes, sorry. Very curious, just sort of continuing on some themes that you hit earlier on. The sort of verification methods of science. I was just wondering if, you know, and it's a very perverse way of asking it, but if you were to give total control over the sort of major scientific institutions, empirically scientific institutions in the world, how would you reform sort of the way that global science works currently?
Oh, if I would be in total control of university, what would I do?
Yes.
Oh, I have some ideas. You know, I'm not sure whether it would make a big difference. I think it would make some difference, but the problem is that every virtue, for instance, the passion, the real passion to know, which should be the fundamental virtue of every scientist, that a virtue can so difficult be institutionalized. Every time people try to institutionalize a virtue, it lapsed into the opposite. Now, the police should create safety, but in the end it becomes a threat to safety in a society. Hospitals should make people healthy, but in the end they become the biggest threat for the health of the people. The church should make people more ethically and morally aware, but it often becomes the seat of immorality, and the university should produce truth, and it is the major production machine of lies, and you can continue for a while. I think there is something intrinsically problematic with the institutionalization of certain virtues in a society. And but that doesn't mean, of course, it could be better than now. The university could be better than now. The first thing is, of course, in one way or another, you have to try to select the people with a real passion to know. You know, but I'm sure it would be difficult. It would be difficult to do it better. It would be difficult. I think that, we have to ask the question whether we should institutionalize it. I don't know, I think we can live in a society without much institutionalization. Well, like the book of David Graeber I referred to, The Dawn of Everything, exactly starts from that question. Like how it was possible that the Indian tribal culture could function without institutions and without power structures. And his answer was, they can function. Or it were the Catholic priests who tried to Christianize these Indian tribes somewhere in the 17th century, I think, starting from the 17th century. They first tried to Christianize them. They soon found out that it didn't work, that they couldn't Christianize them, that they couldn't convert them. And then they did something very useful. They started to observe and describe their tribal life. And one of the first things they noticed was that these Indians don't need institutions and don't need power structures to function. And they asked a very pertinent question as to how this was possible. They wondered how it was possible that the Indians could have a society, make a society function without power and institutions. And they found the right answer, I think. They said it is because these Indians make so much time every week, hours and hours and hours, for sincere speech in public space. And for instance, if someone got murdered in these Indian tribes, he was usually not punished. They took the group surrounding the murderer and then the social group surrounding the victim, and they organized public conversations time and time again until all the toxic effects were literally expressed. And in that way, life could continue without someone being killed, punished, or thrown in prison, usually. And I do believe that in the society which will follow, or in the new culture which might emerge, After this Enlightenment culture, we will function with far less institutions, and the point of gravity of our culture will no longer be a set of institutions, but will be a kind of space in which we practice in a consequent way the art of sincerity, of sincere speech. That's what I think. And the Indians can learn us something about that. Not everything, but they can learn us something about that. No? So I hope there are no universities anymore.
Mattias, before we move on to the next question from the sheets of paper, one comment for you. Great speech at the US Senate. Thanks, and a heart next to it. Thank you. Yes, thank you. And now for the first question, before we move on to the audience again, this actually consists of two questions. The first is main points of self-defense against propaganda, and the other is what is the alternative to the materialism and rationalism?
The main points of self-defense against propaganda, it's very simple. It's sincerity. As soon as you understand, the sincere speech, as soon as you understand the psychology of sincerity, you start to see that the best immunity against propaganda you create by being sincere yourself. The more you practice the art of sincere speech, and I really mean literally practice it. You have to do elementary exercises to practice sincere speech every day, and you will feel how the power of sincerity grows in yourself, how your soul becomes stronger, and you will feel how your intuition becomes stronger. Your intuition which tells you immediately, this is true, and that's false. And the more you will feel how you become immune for propaganda. Really. Anyway, I could talk another hour about the fact that sincere speech is really the most central act a human being can engage in, but I won't do it now. But that's definitely my answer to the question. Like, if you want to become more immune to propaganda, just increase your degree of sincerity of your speech. And do it in a disciplined way. It's not something you have to do now and then. No. Practice it. Just like you practice the art of the martial arts, or piano playing, or violin playing, practice it every day.
Just before we move on to the next question from the crowd right now, the second part of this question was, what is the alternative to materialism and rationalism?
The alternative to materialism and rationalism? Well, in a materialist view of man and the world, you believe that the material phenomena are the basis of everything, and you believe that rational understanding is the highest kind of understanding we can arrive at as a human being. And in an alternative view of man and the world, you start to understand that the essence of the world and of the phenomena around you is not so much rational in nature, but that it is, one, irrational, and in a positive way, ethical in nature. Reality is in the first place an ethical reality. We are in the first place not rational beings. We are beings that live in a dimension of ethics. And I can guarantee you, it's not so long that I really realized that, but the proof for me that it is true is the fact that if you focus on that dimension in life, if you do not so much try to live starting from all kinds of rational or pseudo-rational thinking, but if your first concern in your life with everything you do is the question as to what extent what you do is good or bad, you will very soon notice that you feel much more in touch with yourself, and that you feel much more, that you are much more in touch with the essence of life. The essence of life is ethical in nature. We are ethical beings, and the first question we should ask ourselves is whether what we do is good or wrong or good or bad, no matter what that might mean. But that's what we have to resonate again with. We're a dimension of good and evil, really. And so the alternative to a rationalist and materialist view of man in the world is a view of man in the world in which we know that one, which is much more based on resonating knowledge than on rational knowledge. Einstein, by the way, says in the preface, he wrote a preface for a book of Max Planck, and in that introduction to the book of Max Planck, he says that also science is born from resonating knowledge. He says many people think that the elementary laws of physics and the other major scientific discoveries originate from a supreme capacity for rational thinking, that scientists have a supreme capacity to think rationally. But that's not true, he says. Science is born from a supreme capacity to Einfühlung, he said, which is a German term which means as much as empathic resonance. It's a capacity to resonate, to feel empathy with the phenomenon that you are investigating. It's the capacity to get into the skin of that phenomenon that you are investigating, that is the source and the origin of a really new knowledge. So the alternative is a view of man in the world in which we realize that true knowledge is not so much rational knowledge, but intuitive, resonating, empathic knowledge. That's one thing.
It was very well said, and something that I've discovered myself recently. Zdaj pa naslednje vprašanje iz občinstva. Prosim, če nekdo vidi, preda mikrofon.
Ja, imam mikrofon. Dela. Okay. So,
where is the speaker?
Here.
Ah, good.
Ta tretjič bom pa vztrajal, da pridem na vrsto.
So I wanted to ask you this question yesterday already, but we went in our conversation so deep into the soul that it didn't fit. But I still would like to say it. I think it's important. So the question is, the rich Western European countries are now more vulnerable to manipulations of totalitarian.
Everybody struggles with that word. Yeah. Journalists around the world struggle with the word.
Then the former socialistic, so-called poorer countries.
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Yes.
The word totalitarianism, you don't have to pronounce it. But,
the rich Western European countries are now more vulnerable to manipulations of tea, than the former socialistic poorer countries. Here is more distrust and resistance, so here with us. What can the West now learn from the East, according to you?
Well, one of the reasons why the Western cultures is very vulnerable for totalitarianism is the fact that that people are more highly educated. Education is making people very sensitive for propaganda and for mass information. And the simple reason is, Jacques Ellul explains that in his book on propaganda. Jacques Ellul has written the most sharp-minded book, I think, about propaganda. He says propaganda can never be effective without indoctrination. First you need a prolonged period of indoctrination before propaganda can become really effective. And our educational system doesn't make people think for themselves. It learns to think people all in the same way. So it makes that people think according to the categories of the rationalist view of man in the world, of the materialist view of man in the world. And once they think in that way, they are extremely sensitive for propaganda, which triggers these categories of thinking. So that's one way. Western countries, like in Western Europe, usually have a very high level of education, which makes them more vulnerable and actually more stupid, to say it like it is. And that's by the way, that's also something that the priests who tried to Christianize these Indian tribes remarked, that these Indians, which had never gone to school, were far better in speaking and rhetorics than the highly trained elite of Europe. They admitted that. And they were really surprised by the sharp-mindedness of these native Indians. And so that's one thing we really one of the most problematic aspects of our culture, I think, is our school system and our educational system. That might play a role. And for the rest, like, okay, the more people are disconnected from nature and from each other, the more effective propaganda is. That might also be a reason. People in Western Europe are extremely disconnected. There is extremely high use of technology. Might be several factors. Also, the former communist and socialist countries might have become a little bit immune, or they might remember more about how it used to be when might have become more sensitive to propaganda. I don't know. I'm not sure. I should investigate it more thoroughly. But I guess in any case that you are right. Totalitarianism is never as successful as in Western Europe, I think. What can we learn from you? You tell me. I don't know. I don't know what I can. Yeah? I'm sure that I can learn a lot. Street smart, maybe, and also more sincere, I think. People here are more direct in showing what they feel and think, I believe. Yes, yes. For me, that's one of the big questions and mysteries of Belgium, how they can love their government.
Naslednje vprašanje iz občinstva.
Thank you. I thought to sleep. Excuse me for taking time to present myself.
Wait, where are there? Okay, yes.
To present myself, I'm a translator of your book.
I know.
I'm very happy to get to be in position to hear you, although the publisher did everything to prevent that. I don't know why, but it doesn't matter. I would like to say that I was really overwhelmed with your astonishing presentation. I would like just to add that it sounds very beautiful to have a sincere speech. I would just like to say that it isn't beautiful, because I am in this sincere speech for 20 years, and I can assure you that my 20 years of path in this sincere speech, it isn't beautiful. And I am still in the pursuit of this speech, but I think that if you want to pursue the speech of sincerity, you must neglect everything that society tells you must do. And that's what you are expelled from the society. So if you want to be in the society, forget about sincere speech. That's my opinion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Sincerity and truth always makes you lose something in the world of appearances, in the world of social appearances, inevitably. By definition, truth speech and sincere speech is this kind of speech which destroys social appearances. And so, inevitably, you lose something in the world of appearances, but happily for us, you win something in the real world. That's the point. You win something at the... You damage your ego, but your soul becomes stronger. Literally, there is more energy which is going to the core. So yeah, well, I agree with you in that respect.
Yes, the next
Thank
question...
you for translating the book.
Thank you for writing it.
Yes, thanks.
The next question is again from our basket of questions, and it goes as such. Is it true that only by becoming truthful in our own personal life that we become unmanipulable and thus can also speak public truth? Truth starts in yourself before it can become visible outwards. You agree?
Yes, I definitely do agree. Absolutely. I think the only way in which we can contribute to the solution of the big collective crisis we find ourselves in is by having the courage really to face our own crisis, and more important, it's by having the big battle we should fight is not so much a battle with the power structures, it's a battle with our own ego really, and with ourselves. And as soon as you understand that, you will not feel powerless anymore. You will feel that you can do something and that you can really make a significant contribution to the solution of the fact. I could explain it from so many perspectives, or at least it seems right to me from so many perspectives what someone said there. Yes?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's difficult to do something if you don't internalize it in a way, yes. Next question, naslednje vprašanje iz občinstva, ja, kar izvolite.
Hello, Mattias, my name is Daria, and we are many fighters here, and I'm very glad to meet you here today and to express my gratitude to you, because you was our light in the most black days when we, or me, asked ourselves, is the way we were fighting right? Are we too much exposed? Maybe our families will be punished if we speak loudly. And when I saw your YouTube video and your words where you just speak out loudly, this was, I believe, mine and others' model how to act. And I don't have the questions. I know that we have a lot to fight in the future and to not give up. But I would like to say that your book is very well written, and you brought me from the first page on when you put us to the year 2017 and to that cottage. So I'm looking forward reading your next book, and my question maybe is, do you have any assistance with your writing, or maybe a good editor? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And, I want to say that I'm equally grateful towards you and towards the other people here. I think that the person who articulates the words, who speaks them or who writes them down, often is inclined to take the credits for the words that are spoken, but the people who listen in a sincere way, or at least equally important for the words to be born, can feel that if you are confronted with someone who really has no openness, who really don't think that what you can say has a certain value, the words will die in your mouth. But if there are people, like I feel here in this room, who are really open and who really open up, it is as if the words are sucked to these people through you, and they come very easily. So I think, like, for truth to be born and for sincerity to be born, for resonance to be born, you need always two people. You need someone who speaks and someone who listens, and it's equally important. And it's something good to remember. If you are confronted with someone who doesn't want to listen to what you have to say, when you feel powerless because you have the feeling that the other is not open at all for what you have to say, then you can also, if it's impossible to speak sincerely, there is always a possibility to listen sincerely, to say, okay, I will listen to you. That also creates connection. Oh, well, thank you for what you said.
Before we move on to the next question from the audience, just a beautiful thought for you, Mattias. When we're sincere, we lose many from the broader society, but we maintain the connection with ourselves. We lose the most when we lose ourselves.
Yes, and even...
Yeah, wonderful thought.
Even when we seem to lose people, we do not really lose them. We lose a fake connection. That's what we do.
Yeah. This relates to what you said before about the mirroring we see of ourselves in others. Okay, naslednje vprašanje iz občinstva.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm probably one of those people who have not yet read your book, but I will. I really enjoyed it. But on the question of loneliness, which can be understood in many different ways, difficult to measure. As I understood your speech, you referred to loneliness in a sense that Hannah Arendt also refers to it in the origins of totalitarianism. And you mentioned at the beginning of your speech Theresa May and the first Ministry of Loneliness in the world. Then later we saw one in Japan during the COVID crisis. And here is my question. Since loneliness is not in some societies or some states seen only as an individual matter, maybe a matter for a psychologist, but as a public issue, specifically a public health issue, and the global initiatives now also by the World Health Organization concerning loneliness and connectivity, what do you think? Would such ministries of loneliness become maybe more ministries in sense of Orwell's Ministry of Happiness?
I didn't understand it. I understood a part of it. So like these, what, you refer to the WHO?
Yes.
And you mean that the WHO, they pretend to fight loneliness?
Well, they are now in the beginning of the global initiative to fight loneliness and social isolation,
okay,
and to connect societies again. Vivek, the Surgeon General of the United States that you also mentioned, is one of those initiators of these global initiatives of the World Health Organization. But some states which recognize it as a public issue literally are making policies. Also the EU Commission has recognized it. But I'm wondering for myself, listening to you and the mass formation and the psychology of totalitarianism, if maybe such kind of policies and ministries are not leading to what we read in Orwell, 1948, Ministry of Happiness, which of course controls every soul, sucks the soul out of the people.
Of course, I'm quite sure of one thing. It will lead to the opposite of what they pretend that it will lead. That's quite sure. Instead of less loneliness, it will create more loneliness. I can imagine some things as that they will make sure that everyone has a smartphone and everyone has a laptop so that they connect through the internet with each other. Because if you see, if they pretend that they will fight loneliness, the global institutions, then they have to explain me how at the same time they want to promote digital working from home and so on and so on and so on. So they will create more loneliness. And actually, that's the first thing that every totalitarian state does. It replaces loneliness by isolation. So the first thing totalitarian states do is to limit the freedom of travel for their population and so on and so on. They replace spontaneously emerging loneliness by institutionally created isolation. And because they feel intuitively, as Hitler did or rationally, as Stalin did, that an isolated population falls very easily prey to propaganda. So I would be very surprised if the WHO really did something that will really lead to less loneliness. And indeed, it will be like a ministry of happiness. Yes, of course.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time to answer all of your questions. We're very sorry. We really hope that we will be able to, but because of the deal with the organizers and the venue, we only have a certain amount of time. So we'll take one more question from the audience, and I'll read the 2 questions that I have left. I'm very sorry to everybody who hasn't had the chance to ask. I'll start with one of the questions that I have left, and then potem boste vi na vrsti. Why did we regrettably lose this war despite people speaking up? Why did we regrettably lose this war despite people speaking up?
Well, we might we lose this war?
No. I think that the question is, the opinion is that we have already lost, but...
Why would you have lost? No, I really don't believe so. I think if this crisis wouldn't have existed, we would have to invent it. I mean, we really need what happens now. Even if you take a look at it from a more distant point of view, you see that what happens now, the entire phenomenon of totalitarianism is strictly necessary. It's like a big organism which puts a lot of pressure on a small organism and which drives it through a small tunnel through which it would never go without the pressure of the large organism. It's exactly because society, because this veil of appearances, this fake world created by propaganda becomes so manifest that more and more people start to feel how essential and crucial truth and sincerity is, and how essential and crucial the soul in this other dimension of life is. And in this way, I really believe that what we are going through now will give birth to something really new. And when we look back at what happened now, we will see that there was no other option than go through this process. That's what I think.
Gospa, izvolite.
Can you hear me? Oh, luckily, I don't have a question. But I do remember when I was a child, I really was deep into the attitude, nobody understands me. So I was playing the victim role through my, so on and on. But so I was lucky, because whatever bothers the essence or the child when it's growing, it gives it opportunity to think for himself out of the box. Okay, you don't understand, all right, I better understand myself, know thyself. And I really resonate with what you were saying about children having this ability to recognize and resonate. I think if we lost the war and there's nothing helpful anymore, I'm fine. I found my inner truth is like the child. It has the ability, a lie detector in the guts. It doesn't feel right if somebody is just saying bullshit. Thank you very much. And your speech this is the point. My message to you, I believe the way you speak. I could just stop listening to the words, but it's the vibration, it's the radio frequency that I can tune in and...
The final question, Mattias, and then we're on to the book signing. This is a long one. What do you think about sincere speech in regards to the systematic use and abuse of our fellow sentient beings, farmed animals, who are reduced to mere objects, who are owned, produced, consumed, not out of necessity, but merely for our palate pleasures? This seems to be the topic where it is most difficult to overcome the ego, be honest about it, and speak sincerely. But I think it's extremely important to talk about it. When I talk to people about this topic, there is so much rationalization, so much hypocrisy, so much indifference, so many lies and insincerity, and it goes against their own moral values, really. They all make it clear that they are against animal cruelty, but they all support animal cruelty. No one wants to see them suffer, but everyone pays for it to happen. They all want justice, but they don't want to be just to others. They want peace while systematically slaughtering innocent beings who have never harmed us. And this is the foundation on which the entire system rests. On a lie, on a scam, on deception, on exploitation, on the oppression of the weakest. In our society, animal use and consumption is not a necessity anymore. So you can live healthy lives without intentionally causing harm to animals, or anyone for that matter. Shouldn't we live like this? Wouldn't this be in resonance with honesty and sincere speech? I would really love to hear your opinion on this, because I resonate very much with everything you talk about. Much love.
You know, I don't have to think about how I feel about industrialized animal breeding and meat production and so on. It's terrible, and I really believe that it has to stop as quickly as possible. If that means that we shouldn't eat meat anymore, that's something else. I don't know that. I have sheep myself, and sometimes I have to slaughter some of them, and in the beginning I brought one of them, or a few of them, to a slaughterhouse. And when I returned, I was determined to never do that again. I said, that will never happen again. I will never bring... And since then, I slaughtered them myself, to be honest. I killed them myself. And every time, I doubt whether I will do it again, but I decided for myself, if you don't have the courage to do it, then you will not eat meat anymore. You will have the courage to do it yourself, or you will stop eating meat. And until now, I chose to continue to eat meat. I eat less and less meat, to be honest, without actually imposing this to myself. But what I do think is that if everyone, and of course, some people are not, will not keep animals and stuff, but if most people who eat meat would slaughter or kill their animals themselves, then I think that almost everyone would become more humane because of it. Because you feel at that moment there is something that has to die, because I want to eat and because I have to live. And you know, from the beginning I felt this inner necessity to ritualize it a little bit, to wear a white skirt, to say something to the animal. And I felt at that moment that the equations of life would not be correct if I wouldn't have to die sooner or later. You take life and you give life, and for me, the entire experience is something that makes me much more aware of the fact of the reality of life, which connects me with the other world, literally. I think that if we all would have the courage to, if we want to eat meat, to kill the animals ourselves, it would make us more humane. But if there are a few human beings who kill all the animals, it makes them beast-like. And so that's one of the problems. The large-scale slaughtering of animals is one of the inhumane aspects of our society. And indeed, I agree. We might move to a state where we stop eating meat, maybe. Yes, but I would prefer it to happen spontaneously. The first step, I think, is to make the slaughtering of animal, to let it happen in the best possible way. And the next step might be to stop eating meat, yes, but we shouldn't be too dogmatic. We should allow ourselves, we should be mild with ourselves, allow ourselves some time to go through an evolutionary process, I think, at that level. Huh?
Well said, yeah.
Mattias wasn't ordering meat today for lunch.
No, I didn't. I had a vegetarian meal.
Thank you so much, Mattias. In hvala še enkrat vsem, ki ste prišli.
So again, I thank you people for being here, really. Thank you for the connection, and thank you also for everyone, them in particular, for organizing all this, and for
thank you, Mattias.
the other people who helped in the organization, to my publisher, my translator,